So my name is Mark Jones. I'm a compliance engineer and in-house counsel for Civic Actions. Today I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about open source and government source code. Can I just ask real quick, like, what's the audience makeup? Do we have any lawyers in the room today? No? Okay, all right. That's good. I took out all the super legal slides. Do we have technologists here? Technologists? And are everyone else managers or somebody in the business side, project management, something like that? Yeah. Is there anyone here I did not put into a bucket or a category? No? Got everybody? Okay. So this presentation is going to be kind of a mashup of other presentations I've done, mostly for either technologists, especially around the best practices for developing source code, and for lawyers who don't necessarily work with software or free software. I'm going to kind of run through it real quick. Normally I like people interacting with questions, so if you have a burning question, just please ask it. But there's a lot to cover, so if you don't mind, if you can wait to the end, just hold on to your questions to the end. But if you have a burning desire, I don't want to tell anyone not to ask a question. So a little bit about me. I mentioned before, I'm a compliance engineer, security engineer, and in-house counsel for Civic Actions. Civic Actions is an agile software development provider. We do a lot of work with governments, municipal, state, and federal. All of the products that we provide, or all the services we provide, are basically customizations to free software products. I used to be a technology manager in state government. For about 17 years, I was an IT architect and manager at the University of Connecticut. Came to Civic Actions about a year ago. I've also worked as an attorney at a boutique law firm in Manhattan that specialized in free software. So I've got a perspective on both the legal side of it and the technology side of it. I'm happy to geek out on both sides of that. A little bit of housekeeping. I am an attorney, but I am not your attorney, and none of this is legal advice. If it were legal advice, it'd be much more hedged and detailed, I promise you, because just like all attorneys, I'm never actually going to tell you what you should do. And the other thing I want to mention, too, is I've already done this a couple times. So the presentation's called Open Sourcing Government Code. I will say free software a lot. The thing I will say the most is probably FOSS. Free software, open source, by and large, they're referring to the same set of software licenses that are out there. The differences between them are primarily political and culture. I used to do a lot of legal work with the free software community, which, like the term free software, the term open source is much more business-oriented, was meant to kind of not scare industry with the idea that they had to give things away for free, because if you're in private industry, you certainly can sell free software. It's free as in freedom of speech, not free as in beer. I typically use the term FOSS, which stands for free and open source software. You might also hear FLOSS, it's less common. And the federal government tends to prefer to term the acronym OSS, open source software. So I kind of mix those around depending upon the context. It doesn't really matter which one. When people talk about it, they might have a slight political or cultural shading to it, but they're still talking about the same set of software and software licenses. So a little bit of an outline for what I want to talk about today. Oh, I also talk fast. I'm from the Northeast. This is my normal speaking voice. If I'm going too fast, just raise your hand and I'll try to slow down. Talking about what is open source, some of the government policies at the federal level that exist around it, publishing, and then some of the best practices. So publishing code and what goes into that, encouraging a community around that to really maximize value you get from open source, contributing to projects, both accepting and participating in other existing communities, evaluating FOSS projects, because that's really the big part of free software, open source software, is how do you work with other people and like figure out how to pull in other people's work so you don't have to redo it. And then a little bit about vendor management. Vendor management is not something I get to talk about a lot, but something as a former manager inside of state government, it was my whole job, was trying to figure out how to maximize the value for the state of Connecticut. So it's something I'm really interested in. So if you want to talk about that afterwards, I'd love to get into the details of that and share some more stories. So what is open source? So this is my practical definition that I try to give to, at least maybe not family members, because they mostly just fall asleep when I talk about my work, but when I talk to people who actually care. So what's a free software license or a FOSS license? It's a license that allows everyone to use, modify, and redistribute software with few restrictions. So typically when you're dealing with software licenses from proprietary vendor like Oracle or Microsoft, the way their license is set up, and this is how copyright law in general is set up, is you don't have permission to do anything except for what I say you can do. So free software FOSS licenses are exactly the opposite of that. They say you can do whatever you want except for a couple different things. So you hear a lot of people talking about permissions. I like to think about them as restrictions because there's so much you're allowed to do, it's easier to talk about the few things you're not allowed to do. And we'll talk a little bit about what those few things are. So the other important thing about looking at free software is when they apply. This is what, for like 20 years in the 90s and the early 2000s, really freaked people out is, oh my God, I've got these things that I'm going to be on the hook for, and there's lots of legal liability for it. I think for the most part, private industry has decided that's not a big deal, primarily because when you're looking at them, free software licenses don't have any restrictions on use. So you can use free software for literally anything. There are licenses out there that get widely criticized because they have like a restriction that says you can't use this for an evil purpose, or you can't use this to commit war crimes. And from the free software legal community, we look at it and go like, well, technically that's a restriction on use, so we're not going to regard that as a free software or open source license, right? So they take this pretty seriously. There's literally nothing you're not allowed to use free software or open source software for. You're not going to violate the license doing that. Now, you might have other restrictions on it, right? Like, don't commit war crimes, those are bad. But you're not going to violate a free software license by doing it. It doesn't restrict copying. So once you get a copy of FOSS software, you can make as many copies as you want. You don't have to go and ask someone, can you do this? If someone tells you you can't do it, you'd be like, well, that's not what the license says. You can just keep making copies of it. Which is a big difference with proprietary software, right? There's no counting seats anymore. There's no saying like, well, it's only allowed in this building or on this campus, or it's only allowed to be used for like the medical research side, not for the accounting side. None of that exists with free software licensing. There's also very minimal restrictions on making modifications. A lot of free software attorneys will tell you there's no restrictions to making modifications. It's not technically true. You have to do things like make sure you don't delete like the copyright notices of the people before you. You're supposed to say like, I made this modification so people know that you actually changed it. It's not the same thing that someone else was distributing. But it's pretty easy to comply. It basically comes down to like, if you're going to make changes to it, just highlight that you made changes. And that's as simple as adding a copyright notice or saying, I made changes on this date. You don't even have to specify what the changes are. It's in the code, people can read it. And then there are some restrictions of distribution. So when you're talking about free software, that really is where the obligations kick in for using this. If you're redistributing software to other people, which, if you're open sourcing and publishing on the web, like that helps grow the community, that's where your obligations kick in. And we'll talk a little bit about what those restrictions are in distribution, what those obligations are. So there's two main kinds of free software licenses. There's permissive licenses and there's copyleft licenses. And this is an important distinction to make when you're evaluating what your obligations are around free software. Permissive licenses still have obligations. You still need to mark like when you made a change to the software. And like I said before, like it's as simple as I made changes on this date and it was me who did it. And then copyleft licenses have an additional restriction that says if you're going to give someone else a copy of the software, primarily when you're giving someone a copy of the compiled code, the code that can run, like a copy of an operating system, you also have to provide them the source code. So if they want to make changes, they can do that too. So these are the general categories of things that you have to do when you have a permissive license. You've got to provide a copy of the license, you've got to preserve the copyright notices, you've got to preserve the warranty notices. The warranty notices, by the way, say there's no warranty. They all say that. Like you can use the software anything you want. It may or may not work, but you can't come back and sue the developer for using this. It's actually quite similar to how proprietary software license works. Pretty much all as is, as lawyers like to say. And you have to have those modification notices. A lot of people will say that it's a lot less risky to use permissive licenses because you have fewer obligations. I can tell you as an attorney who's practiced in this area, permissive licenses are violated probably as frequently as copyleft licenses. Some companies are actually worse about following these licenses because they think they don't have any obligations, but they do. So you have to pay attention either way. but they're generally not that restrictive. And then copyleft licenses, as I mentioned before, require you to provide a source code when you distribute to other people. In the technology landscape that we're in today, you really have to look at the programming languages you're dealing with, because if you're dealing with a language like Python or Ruby for the technologists in the room, when you provide a program, you're providing the source code, so it's really easy to comply. But if you're dealing with languages like Java or something like that where it's compiled, you actually do have to make sure you can't just give someone the runnable program, like you have to at least give them the access to the source code as well. It's a little bit bigger deal for businesses that are trying to build business models. They wonder how they can make money. When I talk to governments around this, they're usually like, oh, it's not a big deal. We don't want to sell it. That's more of a hassle. So giving it away is a lot easier. Down at the bottom, there's some examples of licenses. So there's an organization that's a nonprofit called the Open Source Initiative, and they've got a list of popular licenses. It's, I wouldn't say scientifically created, but is an accurate reflection of most people's general sense. These are just some of the most popular licenses that are in use out there. There's about 82, the last time I counted the list, approved open source licenses. These are the most common ones. A lot of times when people first getting involved in this, they start asking the question like, okay, how do I make my own free software license, my own open source license? And pretty much every free software attorney will tell you is you don't need to. Every situation is covered. They've all got this down somewhere. You just have to pick an existing one. And if you make your own free software license, you're just going to confuse people. Because people know their general obligations under these licenses when they're working out there. And if they've got to read your license, they might not use your software, and then you lose out the benefit of building a community around that. So when you're going to look to pick a license, and we'll talk a little bit later, generally you want to use one of the more popular licenses. That's the advice I give to private industry, but for government it's a little bit different. There's a couple other licenses that matter, especially for the federal government. The FARO, the new general public license, is a relatively newcomer to the licensing scene. It's only about 15 years old now. I guess I'm getting old. Which is meant to address some of the more modern challenges with the prevalence of the internet. It's created around 2002. The NASA license gets a lot of discussion in federal open source circles. Not because it's particularly special, but I think it was because it was created by a federal agency. That a lot of federal agencies kind of look to their peers to say, okay, well, what are other people doing? If NASA did it, does that mean we can do it too? So you don't see a lot of people using the NASA license outside of NASA, but you see a lot of people looking at and going like, okay, why did they do this and should we do it too? The most common licenses that you'll see being used by federal agencies today, I think, are the Creative Commons licenses, the CC0 and public domain dedications, which we'll get into a little bit later, because they address some of the kinks in copyright laws that applies to federal agencies. So government policy, why are so many people interested in open source in government today? Well, I think the reason why they're interested in it is probably because open source is here. This is how the IT industry runs. You can't do a significant IT deal now without being concerned about these licenses in some way. Somebody in your acquisition chain is going to be worried about this, whether it's procurement, whether it's your IT manager. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's the attorney for procurement at a Connecticut state agency that I used to work for, and he said, oh yeah, we don't deal with a lot of open source. I said, really, you think that? He's like, yeah, like maybe like once every 3 years we'll see a purchase related to that. I'm like, you do realize that 90% of your infrastructure runs on open source software? He's like, really? I'm like, yeah, trust me, I used to manage half of it. It's all out there. It's like, well, we never see it. I'm like, right, we just downloaded it off the internet. We didn't go through procurement. This is how IT runs right now. If you're coming from a procurement office and you think you haven't done open source yet, they just didn't ask you. And they don't need to ask you because you don't need to buy a lot of this stuff. You can just download it. It's the advantage of there's no contracts involved. It's free, free in the gratis sense a lot of times. But the federal government has, for the last 10 years, started to make some inroads in figuring out how they're going to relate to this space. It's not a lot of changes to FARS because that's more about procurement and purchasing. It's more about policies and like letting people know, yeah, you can use this kind of stuff. So 2009, the Department of Defense came out with some guidance around the use of open source software, which was pretty exciting from the free software community side. We really were excited to see the federal government had like official guidance on how they could use it. And the guidance was positive, yeah, you can use that. There's also an FAQ that goes along with that guidance, so you don't have to read that 50-page government white paper because, no one does. But the FAQs are a little bit shorter and give you what you actually need to do to move forward. And then most recently in 2016, underneath the Obama administration, they came out with a federal source code policy. The federal source code policy is not just about free software, but it speaks a lot to it. So a little bit about what these policies say. The clarifying guidance regarding open source software, which to me sounds like a very DoD title for a white paper. The things that I thought were important coming out of that is that free software, open source software is commercial software. So when you're going through a FOSS purchasing process, there's a special category for commercial software. And that's software you can get off the shelf from another vendor. FARS is very well accustomed to buying commercial software. Things like Drupal are considered commercial software. And open source is commercial software. Even though it's often produced by nonprofit organizations or produced by individuals as hobbies, some of the most prominent stuff is produced that way, it still counts as commercial, at least for government procurement guidelines. Maybe not underneath the IRS tax code, but that's a different legal regime. There's no barriers for the federal government to using FOSS software. And having worked with a couple different states in this area either, I have yet to come across a state that has some kind of restriction on using free software either. It's actually easier to use this stuff. Free software licenses pretty much don't include any of the nasty stuff proprietary licenses do that procurement offices want to negotiate over. It's pretty much as simple as possible. When I engage in contracting with federal agencies and state agencies, a lot of times I say, hey, can we just pull out all of the exceptions that you've got in there for proprietary software? Like, I don't need any of that stuff. I just need you to say, we'll give you an underneath their free software license. And we're like, yeah, but we have to do it that way. Well, you can, but you actually get more rights if we do it this way, and it'll make the contract a little bit easier to read. And depending upon the contracting officer, they might like, oh, I like a simpler contract. And other ones want to do it by the regulations and cut and paste. And that's okay too. They both work. But there's really no restrictions on your ability to use it. And the other thing, especially related to federal government, contractor created code can be released underneath a free software license. Which is a little bit of confusion because a lot of people, I think maybe it's general knowledge, maybe I'm just a nerd and out of touch with the world. People think that any copyrighted works created by the federal government aren't subject to, don't have copyright protection available to them. And they extend that to contractors too, because a lot of times it's hard to tell if it's a contractor's responsibilities and employee of the federal government's responsibilities. But the law actually does make a distinction. So when you're looking at like the ability to use a free software license, you have to have some kind of copyright in place. And the copyright status of federal source code is pretty clear, but it's actually confusing. But contractors have copyright in their code unless it's modified by the contract. So the most recent thing that came out regarding this is the federal source code policy, and I wouldn't be surprised if there are people in the room today who are interested in open source because their manager sent them something about that. I know a lot of our clients are getting questions now from their central IT department looking for information to comply with this policy. Basically, the federal source code policy was an effort that came out in the summer of 2016 to really kind of streamline and maximize the value of government procurement dollars so that vendors would stop selling the same code back to the government over and over and over and over again. So the first thing that it does is it encourages the use of COTS software or commercial off-the-shelf software. So instead of buying code that's been customized for your federal agency, go out and evaluate existing options out there. If you need a content management system, can you just use Drupal? Do you need any customizations at all? Because if you can just use Drupal, then just use it. You don't need to pay anyone for that. Or even if you need accounting software for a small agency, could you just use QuickBooks? It's proprietary software, but it's out there. It's got a fixed cost associated with it. It's relatively cheap. If you can use one of those options, just do it. It's always going to be cheaper. And speaking from someone who works at a company that specializes and sells services around customizing source code, like those policies make a lot of sense. And if you're a technologist whose job it is to write customized code, like the worst contract you can get is to like recreate sort code. You're like, well, they could just download it. Like it's already a thing. It's a boring job for those people. They don't actually want to do the work, at least not the technologists. Maybe the shareholders do. But you don't want to wait for it either if it already exists. The other thing that they require to do, they're asking you to adopt some policies and procedures around that. I'm not going to get into that stuff. That's stuff that really needs to be done at the CIO suite, involved with the attorneys for that agency, and we don't have enough time to go into it. The things that I think are a little bit more interesting around it is there's two key requirements that this policy put out there as it relates to government custom code. The first one is that for every contract the federal government has now, when you're buying custom code, it's a requirement now that the license that the contractor gives you has to be a government-wide reuse license, which means if one agency in the federal government buys that customized code, they're allowed to share it with any other agency in the federal government. They can use it anywhere. So that's to reduce costs in that if the NIH buys some customized code and then the Department of Defense wants the exact same code to the exact same purpose, DoD could just cut and paste the code and use it over there. They don't need to go back to the same vendor and ask them, oh, hey, can you do this again? And then shell over the same amount of money for the contractor to give you the same code over again. The other thing is setting up an experiment. So over the next 3 years, the federal government wants to release 20% of the custom developed code underneath an open source license, which is really what we're talking about here today. And there's a couple reasons why they did that. So looking at what the benefits are to the agencies, it's reducing costs and applying uniform standards, right? So if you're not buying the same thing over and over and over again, you're spending less money. You're spending less money, that's good for the agency, right? You can go on to other priorities. It's also taxpayer benefits, right? So the federal budget's doesn't have to keep growing and growing and growing if we're using the money more efficiently. So that's good for taxpayers in the long run. And those are two general benefits for just the government-wide reuse of code. But they also talk about some benefits for using free software licenses too. So one of them is continual improvement of the code. When you start building a community around a code base, when you get multiple stakeholders interested in developing the code, you get improvements from different places, right? So if you've got some software for medical management software, this is always my example, I don't know what medical management is, but we're at the NIH, so we're going to run with it. If the NIH has some software for keeping track of medical records and experimental studies or something like that, the NIH is not the only government agency that wants to do that in the world, right? They're going to have their priorities. They're going to want features A, B, and C, and D. And they're going to fund feature A because it's their #1 priority. And D might never happen, right? We all know this, our to-do list, right? The bottom of that to-do list might not happen. Well, if the Department of Health in the state of California, they're also pretty big. They're also funding medical research to some extent. Maybe feature D is their #1. If they develop feature D first, and the NIH develops feature A first, well, guess what? If they share, they now both have their #1 and their #4. They can cooperate on that, and they can move forward. So maybe the NIH would never have funded feature D, but they got it for free, so now they can use it, they can implement it, because they didn't have to worry about the budgetary cost of that. And even after that goes beyond there, other people are looking at this for security patches, for fixes, and keeping it current, right? So when you have all of that money, right, it's a block grant or it's a one-time appropriation from Congress or from your CIO's office or whatever research agency you're working with, you get a bunch of money all at once. And after 3 years, the money's gone. And because technology stands still, they'll never give you money again, right? Because it's not like anyone had to upgrade a computer. It's not like the internet didn't exist at one point and now it's in all of our lives at every minute. It's not as if things change. But when you build that community, even if you don't have that funding that year or as much funding that year to keep making progress happen, just to keep the lights on, just so it'll still work in the web browser that you have to run on your computer, somebody else might have that funding, and they're going to be sharing those improvements back to the community. So that's one of the major reasons why they want to look at, can we do these underneath free software licenses? The other thing is vendors participating in rebids on this, right? So when you go out to bid, you never give, I hope you never give, a contractor for the rest of the existence of this agency, as long as you're in business, we'll keep paying you as much money as you decide you want to charge us for the software that you developed for us. I'm like, that would be crazy. But having worked in state government before, having gone through this procurement process as part of my job, I also know that I can't get my internal clients to engage in the contract renewal process more than about a month in advance. And you can't do an RFP from no one even thought about this to issuing an award in 30 days, at least not in the bureaucracy that I was dealing with. I don't even know how you could do that if there was no bureaucracy there. You don't have enough time to think about it. And what you end up doing, even if you hate that vendor, is you end up giving them the contract again because you can't afford to switch to another product. you don't have enough time. Even if you had the money to do it, you can't say, screw it, we're not going to renew this contract. 30 days comes along, they're like, okay, we'll turn it off. You're not allowed to use our product anymore. You can get the license again. When you're using free software, you have a different relationship there. You still have that window. You still need to take the time to select an appropriate vendor, but you're not beholden to them anymore, right? That vendor can't come to you and say, like, well, you know, you can keep using our software and here's this year's rate, and if you don't want to, okay, we'll help you turn it off. And you can figure out how to import your data to another product. When you're using FOSS software, you can say, okay, I'm done with you, vendor. You're not giving the quality service that I want. I have a right to continue to use software for as long as I want. It's not about my relationship with you. I'm going to find someone else to service it. And vendors are on equal footing, because when you go out to do that bid, if the source code for your customizations are out there in public, other vendors can come along and say, like, oh, this is what they're doing. Well, we know how to do this better. Like, we can bid on this appropriately. They don't have to say, well, I'm not really sure what's going on, so I'm going to put a really high price in to make sure I don't lose money on this. Where the vendor you already have, he knows all the things that are wrong there, right? So he knows exactly how much to bid to make sure that he's profitable. Those vendors are now competing on a more equal playing field, and you have a better chance of getting a bid from a better vendor that's appropriate, that you can actually accept. You don't have to keep going back to that same vendor. So you're changing the balance of power in that relationship. So there are some exceptions to this policy generally. People always worry about that. I mean, for the most part, are you creating an identifiable risk to national security or some other risk to the security of the agency or the people involved in the agency? So there are exceptions. In terms of complying with the federal source code policy, I would hope that agencies are having that conversation at pretty high levels now. Most agencies seem to be addressing it right now and looking to go out and start building some of the requirements that need to do that. So what are the requirements here? For the most part, it's creating appropriate policies, right? Because that's what government does, is create appropriate policies. It's listing source code on code.gov. This is part of sharing the code, so it's great if you have a government-wide reuse license, but if you don't know that the code exists out there, that NIH paid for something you desperately need, you're never going to go to NIH and ask them, hey, can we get a copy of that code to use it too? So you've got to be able to share it some way. Indicate if it's underneath an open source license. I thought this was really interesting. Store code and code repository, version code repository, which for the technologists out there, I thought was actually kind of neat. I'm like, oh, this policy is informed by about how technology is working now. And including an open source license in the source code if you're there, which we'll talk a little bit why that's important later on. But it's not too onerous. So one of the things we just talked about is you've got to list it out there somewhere.
Sorry? Here's a question from the code.gov.
Yes.
And then the next line you talked about source code, versioning repositories. I assume that's like GitHub or GitHub.
It's actually not. So, and we'll talk a little bit about that right now. Code.gov is, we just skipped to it, edit it. So code.gov is basically a listing of source code. It's a website index for the most part. And then agencies, I would say, I haven't come across one that wasn't hosting their code on GitHub. These are just links back to their GitHub repository. You could host it somewhere else. Some places host things internally. There are other online providers besides GitHub that provide hosting services. But it's more of an index. So, you know, a list of agencies, a list of the projects, if you can see it here if I'm not seeing in front of it, a short description, and then a hyperlink to the code base. Yeah, it's a little confusing. Everyone thinks, oh, I have to put my code on code.gov. How do I do that? You don't. You put your code in GitHub, and then you get code.gov to link to GitHub. So who is publishing the source code? So this is, I guess it's the same slide. This sometimes trips people up about who should be doing this. I think the question really comes down, who's the lead technologist? So this really relates to your relationship with vendors. If you've got a lot of in-house technology staff writing source code, you might have the IT architect, the person in charge of the overall project who knows the technology stuff on your staff. I think that's the person who should be responsible for this. They own the technology. They're the best person to publish it. But if you're in a relationship with a vendor, we have this with some of our clients, where you're basically, it's the vendor working with business people directly. The business folks don't know what GitHub is. They don't know what a code version repository is. Ask your vendor to do it. Like, they should know how to do these things. If your technology vendor doesn't know what GitHub is or doesn't know how to use a code version repository, cancel the contract. Because that's normal software development practice at this point. It's a pretty reasonable ask. It should take them a couple hours if they're doing things right. So where to publish code, GitHub. Forge.mil is something inside of the DoD. For the most part, Forge.mil is remarkably similar to GitHub, except you can use CAC to log into it. So it depends upon what you want to do with it and your security requirements. Like I said, code.gov is basically an inventory where you list it. It's a way for people to find the source code. It doesn't actually store the source code. The other thing you need to think about when you're publishing source code is choosing a license for that. This, to me, is the most interesting part. This is the kind of stuff that I really like to geek out on. So some of this is really geared towards like how I've been trying to communicate this to businesses. So excuse the phrase business strategy. But I tend to think that any organization, any endeavor, you've got some kind of business strategy. What's the purpose of the relationship you have here, right? So purpose of my relationship with my partner is to like have a happy life, right? So how are we going to make that happen? Saving for retirement, vacation plans, you know, which family we go to on holiday. But we've got a strategy about how we're managing our life there. Private companies, they want to make money, but they've got a strategy for making money. Government agencies have a purpose, right? If you're at the NIH, you're doing medical research to save people's lives. That's your business strategy. When you're looking at technology, you should be asking the question of, okay, how does this relate back to the purpose of our agency? You need to know that when you're choosing the kind of license you want. You want to know what your relationship is with that source code, with that computer. The other questions you want to look at is, are you using any copyleft licenses? And we'll talk a little bit why that matters. And you want to encourage other contributions to the project. Some people don't actually want other people to do it. They just want to put the code out there and let them do their own thing. Other people want to form relationships with elsewise. But the first question that most government agencies have is like, are we even allowed to use a FOSS license? And as a lawyer, of course, the answer is, well, it depends. I'm not going to tell you that answer. But I'll tell you a little bit about the complexities of it. So free software licenses are copyright licenses. And there's a problem. The US government doesn't have copyright in its own work. The US government made that choice, but they also made the choice to say that if the US government pays a contractor to develop a copyrightable work, that contractor by default has copyright in that work, and you can change that by contract. So perhaps you have a contract that says, contractor, you're going to make this source code, it's covered by copyright, but you have to give us the copyright to it. So the federal government can actually own copyrights and things. They just don't get it when they make the works themselves. So it gets a little tricky. But the answer is yes, you can use these FOSS licenses. It's just not from the work that the federal employees are doing directly themselves. So you have to think about it a little bit carefully. The other things to think about too, if anyone here is a state employee, by and large states do have copyright in their own work. I find that to be a wide misnomer where people say, oh no, it's the state of California, we don't have copyright in our works. It's not true. There are some very quirky laws at the state level around this. Almost no one understands it. You can't call up a lawyer in your GC's office and they'll give you the answer off the top of your head. You just have to assume they have copyright there. That's the risk-averse way of moving forward. So generally, because the federal employees don't have copyrights in their own work, you'll find a lot of federal agencies like to release their source code underneath the CCO, Creative Commons Zero license, which is basically saying, hey, this is in the public domain, at least within the United States, but just to be clear, if there's any questions outside the country, it's also in the public domain to the extent that it's allowed to be in that other country. So that's very popular. You'll see agencies like 18F or the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau advocating using the CC0. But there are other choices. The Defense Digital Service, which is related to 18F, it's kind of their branch office over in the Department of Defense. They did something back in March where they kind of did a legal hack to say, well, technically we have copyright in other countries. We don't have copyright inside the United States. So what we're going to say is we want contributions from third parties. If you give us your contribution, you can only give it to us underneath this particular FOSS license. And we're going to say the US government is asserting in other countries where copyright exists this FOSS license. So technically in the US it's public domain, but you try and figure that out, or just comply with the FOSS license. We'll see how that holds up. But so far, Defense Digital Service has gotten a really positive response from the FOSS legal community. And it seems like the higher-ups in the Pentagon and then some other people involved in government IT kind of like the idea too. And I'm seeing a lot of state agencies looking at this now too, thinking, okay, what's our business strategy? How do we relate this to what we want to happen there? So business strategy. What do you want to do? Well, if you're a government agency, it's not about making money, right? So it could be about reducing costs for encouraging reuse, standardization, development from third parties. reducing vendor lock-in, more competitive bidding. This is what was announced in the federal source code policy, right? So that's kind of the business strategy that the CIO for the federal government has said. Our business strategy when it comes to FOSS is, we don't want to make money off of this. We want to encourage cooperation. We want to get the benefits from working together, and we don't want to be as dependent upon our vendors. But to your individual need, and it can change from project to project, you might have different interests there where you want to emphasize different things. The other thing you need to think about when you're choosing these licenses is that it's very rare for someone to start an open source project at this point in time where they're not using other open source code. So this is one of the big restrictions there. If you're using a Copyleft license from a third-party library in your own project, you need to comply with that license. And that generally will have some impact on what kind of license you can release your own project under. If you're using permissive libraries, you need to follow their licenses as well, but they're really not going to dictate what kind of license you can use yourself. So I have a client right now who got some code from a private company, and the private company decided to release it underneath the AGPL. And they asked me, okay, what do we have to use? I'm like, well, you're using a third-party library underneath the AGPL. I'm hearing you say that you need to use this third-party library. Your project's the AGPL. And they're like, well, what if we don't want to? And I'm like, well, we can talk about if that's good or bad for you. But if you use that library, you're using the AGPL. It's just a requirement of that license. As it turns out, they're like, no, that's the perfect license for us. There really was no issue there. And I find that to be true a lot of times of like, as soon as you're like, well, it has to be GPL or it has to be AGPL, and what are those implications? They're like, well, we wanted to share the source code anyway, so great, it's perfect. We don't have any choice. It actually kind of makes it easier on the bureaucracy side because you can go to the lawyers and say like, we really don't have any choice, so like you really can't talk us out of this. It's great to give your lawyers no choice but to say yes. And then the other thing when it comes to choosing a license is you want to encourage users to contribute to the code. So normally in the FOSS legal community or the FOSS software development community, we talk about permissive versus copyleft license, and those are the words I've used so far. But the DoD has another terminology, permissive versus protective, that shows up in the FAQ. And that's really about like, do you want private industry to be able to take that code and sell products based on it? Or do you want to require that contributions made public so you have the option to bring it back? And sometimes, depending upon what your role in government is, you might be trying to stimulate business, and you're totally okay with a private company coming along, taking the code, making a product off of it, and not contributing back because you're just trying to stimulate a new industry, and that's fine. But that goes to your business strategy, right? What you really want is to bring a community together where you're sharing and cooperating on developing this moving forward. You might want private industry to be involved in it, but you don't want them forking it off to their own direction and then trying to sell it back to you. And if that's the case, then a copyleft license might be more appropriate. But you really have to think about what your relationship is to the source code and the other people in the world who might be using it. So how do you encourage a community? Well, encouraging a community, I think of like communities are communities, right? There are people involved in this. So what values promote that? To me, there's transparency, inclusiveness, effective communication, speaking slowly, which I'm not great at, culture of appreciation, and recognizing the motivations of others, right? If you're rude to other people, if you're not appreciating what they're bringing to the community, if you're not effectively communicating with them, if you're being secretive, it's really hard to build a relationship that's like positive moving forward, right? So how do you engender those values in a free software community? So to me, these are some of the things that you need to look at. Is like you need to provide people with an overview. What is this community about? You need to pick a license that reflects the kind of community that you want. You need to tell people how to get involved. You need to be welcoming, right? You can't go out on a date with somebody if you don't ask them out on a date or you don't say yes. Like, you have to encourage that involvement. You've got to give them a way to engage in the relationship. No one ever woke up and was like, oh, I didn't know I've been married to you for the last 5 years, right? Like, that happened for a reason. You should have a plan going forward, right, to make sure you're on the same track. Because if you're not on the same track with your partner and you're just moving forward with your own life plans, 10 years down the road, you're going to be like, wow, I haven't seen my partner in 2 weeks. I've just been traveling. They've been traveling. They're in a completely different station in life. Is this relationship working anymore? So you've got to share what your plans are. And you have to be able to talk about how do you get help. And you have to acknowledge the help you're getting from others, right? You've got to appreciate other people. And you've got to be able to talk about how that relationship's going to get through the rough spots, because there's always rough spots. So there are some common ways of doing this. And I know I'm glossing over a lot of stuff. If you have questions about any of the particulars on this, I will be happy to talk about any one of these bullet points, like, forever. the way FOSS projects typically do this is through the code base. It's not so much the source code now, it's the documentation they put in that. So typically if you go to any random GitHub repository, there's going to be a file called README. By convention, it's all in uppercase, those aren't typos. The README file gives you that overview. It orients someone who's looking at this project. What does this source code do? What's the license under? And it's going to point you to other resources. So it might point you to a license file that spells out that license in detail. So if you want to know the legal obligations for using this code, you can find that out. It's going to have a contributing file. The contributing file is my favorite file, and it's also the file that changes the most from project to project. But it's going to say, how do you get involved? Where do you get the resources? The best one of those contributing files are going to say things like, if you're a new developer on this project, this is how you get the code up and running. This is our expectations for what code should look like to get it there. Tabs versus spaces, this is where you put the curly brackets. Really formatting, like this is what our grammar is for good, well-written code, just like with writing standards. It's going to have a public issue tracking so that you can go there and see like, oh, these are the problems that people are reporting. You don't want to look for a code base that has no problems. That means that they're either not telling you or they don't know. Everything has problems, right? Just like every relationship has problems. Everybody knows they're working on something with their spouse right now, like, hey, we're not spending enough time right now, like you keep leaving your socks around the house, like there are issues. And if you're not talking about those things, you can't fix them. You can't come to a space where it's like, okay, you can leave your socks on the bedroom floor, but not in the living room. Like you've got to work on those issues. Nailing this to encourage communication. Just because you're the project creator or the maintainer doesn't mean that you have to be the person who answers all the questions. A community is about people interacting as peers. So having some way to have a discussion across each other is really important for creating that. And then an acknowledgements file. I think it's weird because it's a really long file. It's more than 8.3 characters. But it's probably my second favorite file, where it's not just the copyright holders that should be acknowledged in this, especially when you're dealing with federal government, because there might not be copywriters. But who do you want to honor in this and say, like, hey, these are the people who really helped us out? You might want to say a federal agency. You might want to say specific individuals. And maybe they're not software developers. Maybe they're the person who's just like the first person to answer a question on the mailing list, or the person who's always telling you about all the bugs in your code and like doing really great bug analysis, say like, there's this bug, and here's exactly how you replicate it. Like those are the people that you want to honor there. Or maybe it's just the person who really talks up your project and encourages other people and gets them motivated to do it. I've been involved in a lot of free software projects before, and all those people have a role. And the better the project, the more diversity you're going to have. The better the project, the more non-tech folks you have involved in that project. So contributing. This is just the federal source code policy again, so I won't say it. But part of the advantage of FOSS is that you're getting contributions from multiple sources. So you need to define those relationships with your peers. How do you get contributions from other people into your project? You need to think about what kind of relationship you have there, but you also need to think about how you're going to contribute to other people's projects. And I'm going to go a little bit quicker because I've got way too many slides. So what are your standards for accepting those contributions? You should know, like I said before, like what the style should look like, what license you're getting from them, and you should have that written out in a contributor policy so you're effectively communicating that to anyone who comes across your project. They know how they're going to participate here. They know what the standards are, their objectives, they can do that. Underneath the federal government, in the community, there's two ways of doing this. You can have a contributor policy and say, okay, you've got to sign an agreement. It's a contract between us. It says you're giving us the license, we need this. Or you can do something called the Developer Certificate of Origin, which came out of the Linux kernel project. I'll be happy to talk about the finer difference between that. It's a great topic for lawyers to get into. The federal government also has the procurement process, right? So if you're hiring a contractor, you can tell them, like, okay, I'm giving you a lot of money right now, but I want you to release this as an open source project, or I want you to contribute back to this other open source project, and here are my standards. So you can dictate that and say, like, this is the relationship I want, and enforce that through contract. And when you're contributing to other projects too, you're using these other third-party libraries. If you come across a bug that's affecting how it works, or you've got a security problem, please don't fix it for your project. You don't want to do that. You want the bug fixed upstream. If you fix it for your project, you just created a new project that no one else cares about, and you have to maintain it forever. If you find that bug and you contribute it upstream, guess what? You don't have to maintain that anymore. You can just keep downloading that library, never think about it or contribute to it again if you don't want to, and that bug fix will still be there. As soon as you patch someone else's code, you own it, and they don't care about your patch anymore if you're not sharing it, which means you'll never be able to upgrade that library unless you do a lot of work. You're going to have to maintain that patch forever, and you could be losing out on security fixes or feature enhancements. So don't be shy about contributing to other projects. That's the most effective use of your money. If you hire contractors and they're not contributing back to third-party libraries, find new contractors because they're wasting your money, because you are definitely paying to maintain those bug fixes going forward. But if they're contributing it back to Upstream, you don't need to pay for that anymore, or at least you're going to get some reduced costs around that. When it comes to evaluating FOSS projects, I told you a little about what the right things to do on your own projects, having those files that I listed out there. Well, when you look at another project, you want to look at the same thing, right? So are they communicating effectively about how to contribute to the project? Do they have a clear license on there? Are there open issues? That's good if there are open issues. It means people care about the code, especially if they're recent. Are there closed issues? Or are there closed issues from a day ago? That's awesome. Somebody fixed it. Are there closed issues from 3 years ago? Okay, well, if there are open issues for the last 3 years and there's only closed issues from 3 years ago, well, maybe no one's paying attention to it anymore. But it's common sense stuff to be transparent about. Are they being transparent about the maintenance of this code? And is the license aligned with your business strategy, right? Don't go out, if you've decided not to use a Copyleft license and there's a library out there that's licensed underneath Copyleft, don't go include that in your project, because guess what? You just changed the license on your project. This is just an example of a project from the DoD that kind of looks healthy. Doesn't look great up here, but vendor management. So vendor management, this is just a quote again from the federal source code balance, so you can see that it relates back. To me, this is all about changing the balance of power, right? As soon as you are in control of this, you're using these FOSS projects, like you have as much information as your vendor does now. And that might not mean a lot if you don't have a big technology staff, but when you go out to bid again, if you can share with every person bidding on it all of the knowledge there, you've changed that negotiating power. You don't have that special vendor anymore who knows more than anyone else, can have a better proposal and a better price. Now you're going to get more bidders. And if you're looking to buy something, right, when you're the person that everyone's coming after, when you're the person that people need something from you because they don't have any special advantage, you're going to get a better deal. So requiring vendors to open source the code they're creating for you is really saying to you, like, hey, it's great we're having a positive relationship right now, but part of this relationship is that you need to set yourself up to lose this contract. And you should know that. Because in 2 years, when this contract's up for rebid, you know very well that we're willing to walk. So for the next 2 years, you better do a good job, right? And in 2 years, if they didn't do that good job, you really can walk and go to another vendor who will have the ability to do it. And they're not going to come back to you and say, well, your product's great, but unfortunately I don't have access to the source code, so I need to pay you, you need to pay me to rewrite it all. They might come to you and say, like, your product sucks and I'm going to have to rewrite it all, but in which case, you like that, right? You got rid of the wrong vendor, now you've got hopefully a better vendor, and you're paying for something useful. But you don't want to pay for rewriting good stuff. So it really kind of changed the dynamic in that relationship there. We're getting close to 50 minutes, and I want to leave you time to ask questions. But vendor evaluation, this really comes down, like, judge them on the health of the FOSS projects that are out there, right? It's not that hard to see if a FOSS project is healthy. Are there open issues? Are there closed issues? How long is that happening? When was the last time they updated the code base? Do they have these files? You don't need to be a technologist to look at a contributing file and say, like, oh yeah, this is documentation on how to participate in this. Even if you don't have other people participating in it, you want that to be healthy so that next time you go out to rebid, the person who's bidding on it, who's not the current contractor, can say, oh, this is how I can start on this code base. So even if it doesn't have a huge community around it, you might have a really specific purpose and it's just not going to get other people involved and motivated. That's fine. Your vendor should still be having that file there. One, because you don't want to pay for their new employees who have no idea, they have no experience with it, but they hired a new employee. Like, how long is it going to take them to get up to speed? This contributing file will help them. It'll use your money better underneath the current contract. And two, it makes it easier to kick that vendor to the side of the road because the new vendor will be able to read that file too. Judging vendors on how to participate in other communities, like I said, if they're not contributing patches back to other products, then you should kick them to the side of the curb. If you've got a customized solution based on Drupal, and your vendor is not contributing patches back to Drupal, ask them why. Are they doing bug fixes? Are there features or modules that they're creating at this point in time that could be shared with other people? Because why are they holding on to that? If they hold on to that, that's great. They know about all of this. But that makes them more powerful in this vendor procurement relationship. The more they share, the more power you get, the less power they have in this relationship. So make sure they have those healthy relationships. And you don't need to be a technologist to judge this. Just ask them if they're doing it, right? And if they lie to you, that's a different problem. You can usually kind of tell, right? If they say yes, they're doing it, then just ask for evidence of it. Like, it's really kind of hard to fake that. Because the evidence should be like, here are the patches to the Drupal website that we contributed, and here's the name of our employee, who you probably know, right? So if you see a name there, like, well, I've never heard of that person, ask them, like, are they working on our project or are they not working on our project? You have that right as the procurement side. And then, generally look at are the vendors fulfilling the purpose of the federal source code policy here? Which the purpose here is to kind of lessen the power of vendors. So they might not be happy about it, but hey, you're the person with the money, right? You've got the power in the relationship ultimately. You can dictate this. And now there's a policy out there you have to follow, so it's not something you can really negotiate about. So some quick examples related to this. 18F created a website analytics product for all of the federal government websites. The city of Philadelphia is using it now, right? This is the advantage here. How much money did the city of Philadelphia save because 18F created this for the federal government? And how much money did 18F spend to allow the city of Philadelphia to do it? I don't know how much money the city of Philadelphia saved, but we all know it wasn't a small amount of money, right? Because nothing's cheap. 18F created it. They were going to create it anyways. They wanted it for their own purposes. The fact that the city of Philadelphia downloaded it from GitHub, literally there was no additional cost for 18F to allow them to do it. And there'll be no additional cost if Chicago does it or LA does it. 18F might not even know about it. There's no cost there. And then another one, which as a lawyer is near and dear to my heart, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, publishing regulations, anything more boring in government than that, right? 18F is doing it too, right? Would the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau or the Alcohol and Tobacco Firearms Agency Bureau ever get together to work on a project together? It's probably not going to happen. Not because it couldn't happen, but it's probably because they don't go to the same conferences. They don't have a lot of commonality in their structure. The president's probably not going to come and say, "Hey, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, I heard that ATF is doing something similar. You guys should get together, right?" And maybe the secretaries work together, but
I'm the role runner, so we got the speakers for this class here.
Okay. All right, so that's the end of it. If anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to talk to you outside. Thanks.